So if you're claiming, which is, by the way, based on your religious interpretation, this is your promised land, and the Jews had a very strong connection to it. By the way, the Jews have every bit of a strong connection to Egypt, if not even stronger. Does that make it right for them to take over Egypt? Probably not. Definitely not. Sorry, what do you mean probably? But if that's, so if that's your claim, and you came back 2,000 to 3,000 years after, then why can't a Palestinian go back 73 years after?
Hi, this is the Ignoramus' Guide to Surviving Humanity. I'm Ileana Chan, and this is my co-host,
Anne Montavon.
And we have a very special guest, the behavioral political economist, Ahmed Sharan. He was on a previous episode with us to explain the deficit myth. And today he's here to explain, to make us understand the Palestinian Israel situation. I almost said conflict and then realized that would immediately make me too ignorant. So I stopped myself and said situation.
And if you want to listen or watch the other episode, then you can go to our YouTube page. You can go to Spotify or Apple Music.
Or Amazon Music.
Or Amazon Music.
Or Amazon Music. And if you want to help us grow, then you can go to our Patreon and become a patron. So that would be really exciting. But so we watched Gaza Fights for Freedom, the Abby Martin documentary, to sort of get us into a space where we could, hopefully ask informed questions about this. And also, get your thoughts about the film and the situation in Israel and Palestine. So I guess the first question would really be, what did you think of the film?
Well,
Should we?
Go ahead. Well, thanks for having me. I watched the film and I really liked it. I think it was a very accurate depiction of what is going on the ground in the Gaza Strip. And I think it sent a very important message to the audience groups, wherever they're located, because those are not things that are usually covered in mainstream media outlets. So I think it was extremely important to show a peaceful demonstration being met with heavily militarized, machines, and to expose all the atrocities and the wrongdoings that are being committed against the Palestinians almost on a daily basis in the occupied Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So I think Abby did a great job. I mean, I personally watch her other works too. She's a great journalist and is very much familiar with the Palestine-Israel conflict. So we need more of the well-informed journalists, intellectuals to sort of voice their opinions and make their stories more easily heard and acknowledged.
Yeah, that's one of the really important things that you're saying here about that documentary, because I often hear this sort of sentiment about Palestine where people say, oh, why don't they, instead of Hamas throwing rockets over to Israel, why don't they just peacefully protest? Why isn't there a Palestinian Gandhi? That's something that I've heard before. And this just really, in the documentary, she shows how the Great March of Return, which was a peaceful protest at the border, was met with systematic killings of people just marching there, unarmed, sometimes maybe holding a flag, and they were actually shot by snipers. And so journalists on the ground have described that systematic killing and how slow it was and how targeted it was against these peaceful protesters. As one of the journalists said, it was the most chilling thing he'd seen, worse than covering wars in Syria or Libya, something so systematic and slow and just the killing of these people. And it was completely peaceful.
Absolutely, because it just goes to prove that there is a confrontation between one of the world's strongest armies, supported by the world's superpower against a defenseless group of innocent civilians who are simply fighting to get their basic human rights. And this has always been the Israeli strategy, is to continue to alienate and fight with machines the mere Palestinian presence. There's been talks about, why can't the Palestinians, negotiate peace, but negotiate peace with whom? Your occupier? Since when do you get, like, your occupier, that's their designation, right? Your occupier is meant to occupy you. He's not, he or she or whatever
you cannot negotiate if you have absolutely no power. If you're the completely powerless person in that scenario, how do you negotiate with someone who has like all the power? Like, I think but let's like back up a little, because I think we're getting into the weeds with this documentary that is very emotionally affecting. And I really feel like everyone should watch that, because it's just a kind of a good introduction and yet very accurate to what's actually happening on the ground. But it was 2018. So actually things have probably gotten a lot worse now, because one of the things she said in that documentary was that by 2020, there won't be enough water to make that area livable in Gaza. So, but it's a very like a worthy documentary to watch, I think. So, but let's back it up. So let me throw it to Anne. And Anne, like, let's start us off with an ignoramus question about the Israel-Palestine.
Oh, goodness. Well, I didn't really know anything that was happening. I was that ignorant American who's like, what? Oh, they're bombs? Like, okay, somebody's pissed off at somebody else. And really, just when we were meeting, Ahmed, and you said that you didn't have a birth certificate, right? From Palestine, that you identify as Palestinian. Did I get this wrong? I feel like I got this wrong.
I was not born in Palestine. You're right.
Oh, okay. And I was like, that's interesting. And then watching John Oliver, it's like, this is, Israel's just being a dick. They have all of this power, etc. Like somebody, like, it's too much to go into the history. And I realized I didn't know anything that was going on. And so watching this documentary was all new things to me. And I also watched Born in Gaza, which I kind of have fused them in my mind. So that's honestly why I was a little silent on the last section, because I don't remember which is which, but it's horrifying just, to see they have nowhere to go. There's no supplies. I guess, okay, I'm going to actually take what Ileana wanted me to do and ask the ignorant question. So why are all of these people in Gaza? That's a very big question. But
many of those people are descendants of families who are actually not from Gaza. In 1948, when the state of Israel was created on historical Palestine, it was created on almost 78% of the land that was considered historical Palestine under the British Mandate. And so Palestinians became refugees in 1948. A big chunk of Palestinians went to the Gaza Strip. Many others went to the West Bank and other neighboring Arab countries. So, I mean, of course, you have the original inhabitants of Gaza, but in addition, you have people who have, fled wars and conflicts from 1948, and now became Gazan residents by virtue of 73 years of residence, basically. So it's considered one of the most densely populated regions in the world. You have a very small strip and close to 2 million inhabitants. Living conditions are horrendous. And Gaza, an important fact here, we're talking about a strip that has been under Israeli siege for the past 15 years. So the Gazans don't even control their ports. They don't control their borders. Israel counts the calories that go into the Gaza Strip. it's that devastating. It's even, you know, on many different levels, you know, the situation is even a lot more devastating than the situation in the West Bank, which is the other part of the Palestinian occupied territories. So when we're talking occupied Palestine, we're referring to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank that is next to Jordan. You know.
So, but there's no movement because Gaza is considered, I've heard this term when referring to Gaza as like an open air prison. And
Yes.
she kind of talks about it in the document. She does talk about it in the documentary that there's no way out. Like you can't even exit through the sea. So what about the West Bank? So like Gaza, there's no movement between the West Bank and Gaza either.
Israel controls the movement
So yeah,
entirely.
so there's no way
because there is no independent Palestinian state. There is no Palestine from an official perspective, does not really exist. Unfortunately, it's still under this brutal military Israeli occupation. But there's clearly a different strategy for occupying Gaza, because, you know, that's where the Hamas militants are based. And so Israel has different strategies and different ways of controlling two regions. You know, there's the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank that coordinates with the state of Israel on matters related to governing and managing that area. But then there isn't that connection with the Gaza Strip. And so Israel sort of, you know, controlled the strip entirely by imposing heavy sanctions. You know, they're sanctioned. They don't have full access to their waters, to their airspace, to their, you know, just near borders. The Egyptian border is close too. There is no free movement. It's definitely a prison. I mean, I agree with that. And it's a humanitarian crisis too. And Israel should be held accountable. And, you know, for all these, you know, crimes and atrocities committed against humans, you know, regardless of religion, ethnicity or whatnot. You know, you have an Israeli force, which is the recognized force in historical Palestine. So this message has to be sent to them and to the international communities or governments that support this recognized state of Israel, right? Because when we're talking about Israel and Palestine, we can't just hold two parties equally accountable when power dynamics are clearly working in favor of one party and at the expense of a defenseless population. As Ilhan Omar pointed it out in Congress, this is not a conflict between two states. It's not. There is no Palestinian state. So it is a conflict between a recognized, fully established military power that has been historically backed up and supported by international Zionism and heteropatriarchal post-colonial capitalism, and a bunch of defenseless Palestinians who had been residing for hundreds of years in their historical ancestral homeland. The conflict is between a group of people and a state that I consider to be a post-colonial Western outlet.
So let's break down what that means. When you say the powers, I can't even repeat what you just said. But essentially, what are the imperialist powers that you're talking about? Which countries are they? What countries are involved in the creation of Israel?
Historically, it was European countries, the United Kingdom, Germany, and of course the United States. But then the emphasis, you know, is more with the U.S. as opposed to Europe. But I mean, historically speaking, let's just say it. The Jewish communities were historically present all across Europe, and they were a prosperous community. They were ostracized and discriminated against heavily by historical ancient Europe. You know, I would call it racist Christian Europe, because that's what it was. And those were, you know, a minority, a visible minority group. I'm talking about the Jewish communities, and they were ostracized for being different, you know, just for being Jewish. They were very prosperous, very commercially advanced, and they, you they were doing well in different fields, and they had special relationships with the emperors of ancient Europe at the time. So they were favored for their skills. And so that sort of, from a historical perspective, created a great deal of, tensions between the Christian Europeans and them, because the Christian Europeans felt like they were not as important. So I feel, and that's my personal interpretation of like history, it created some jealousy and tensions between the two groups. And obviously in the Second World War, you're aware of the Holocaust and the atrocities that were committed against the Jewish communities in historical Europe, but the Palestinians were not involved whatsoever. I mean, Palestine is in the Middle East. It's not a European country. And, so there were the escalation of political events led to the creation of a state that would work to serve bigger political interests of Western powers, but would also be a place that would house the Jewish communities wherever they're located. So there you go. International Zionism as a political ideology was created in the late, was created and supported heavily in the late 19th century. And which, by the way, was created by mainly atheist Jews. So for people who say, like, for people who mix between Judaism and Zionism, those are completely separate terms. Zionism and Judaism are completely separate and independent of one another. So, and the early creators the early Zionists who, were responsible for the creation of the state of Israel and, all that political mess that, ended up happening in historical Palestine were atheists who had a strong, who had a vision, a political vision in that region. And so they were politically motivated. Obviously, there were the Christian Zionists too, but it's independent of, genuine, Judaism or, religion, basically. So
if they're atheists, why did they choose that region?
Well, I mean, there were atheists, there were smart, controlling atheists, powerful,
so they understood that would be easily persuasive to a religious.
Well, I mean, religion has always been used throughout history. Religion has always been used to control the masses and to serve bigger political agendas that are independent of, I mean, most world leaders are not genuinely religious. That's, this is, I mean, I don't know if you may agree or disagree, but genuine religion is a mere connection, a special sacred connection between man and their creator, and it should not leave the confines of the bedroom, in my opinion. That's genuine religion. And it could be Judaism, it could be Christianity, Islam, whatever. But once, you engage religion in political discourse, then we're having problems. And that's exactly what we have in, Palestine versus Israel, because you have a state that wants to establish itself and maintain itself as a pure Jewish identity state that is made for only Jews. And this is again mixing religion with politics at a time, progressives around the world are trying to get rid of, any sort of, politicized religious intervention. Societies are now trying to liberate themselves. So we're moving forward, we're not moving backwards. But unfortunately, the state of Israel is becoming more increasingly divisive and religious, in the sense that it wants to, it wants world recognition, as a Jewish state just for the Jews, based on biblical beliefs.
I mean, I think, there are two ignorant questions that come up for that. Like, one, the idea that Israel was uninhabited when it was formed, right? I think some people were sort of fed that idea. And therefore, that's why when the Jewish people moved in there, it's like their own land, because it was really no one else's but theirs.
Oh my God. I mean, I thank you for raising that point, because it's a very important point. For me, I consider Palestine a national identity that is a mere reflection of cultural aspirations, lifestyle, and just achievements in general, human achievements in, in art, medicine, different intellectual fields. Palestine was very well established. Palestinian society was established well before the creation of the state of Israel. And Palestine was actually one of the unique areas of the Middle East in the sense that in a relatively small area of land, you had several cities, towns, villages, and areas that were very much unique. You had different lifestyles, different people, different, colloquial Palestinian Arabic is very much different depending on where you're from and what city your parents are from and where you grew up. And so there was a thriving culture that was extremely prosperous in comparison. Now we're talking about historical Palestine. So we're, going back to the 20s, 30s and 40s and even before. It was very much, distinct and, and very culturally rich. So for someone to assume that this was a land that was empty, that is like flat out, I don't know. It's not even ignorant. It's just funny ignorant. I don't know what it
But it's quite a common idea, isn't it? Like, would you say you've heard that too, Anne?
No.
You haven't?
I haven't heard that.
I think I heard it in a Seth Rogen interview. He said that when he was growing up, that's what he was told. I mean, he's Jewish. So he was kind of told, we had a promised land and we went there because it was ours. Never mind that there was people there.
A land without a people for a people without
established
a
people. Yeah. It was just like somehow very convenient. This was this land. So, okay. And that brings me to the other. Do you have an ignorant question, Anne, or just a question? Doesn't have to be ignorant, because I have one as well.
Oh, go for yours.
Well, it brings me to the other language that is like finally being used right now. I think in the past few months, there's been the Human Rights Watch, which, is a very neoliberal organization. It's something that I tend to think of as a very interventionist, imperialist human rights organization and suspect, but they actually surprisingly came out with the statement that Israel is apartheid. I think they did. And then the other one was the Israeli human rights organization in Israel called...
Salem?
Yes, exactly. They also came out and said apartheid, which is like the first times, I guess, that people are using that sort of language, weirdly. But why? So what is the case for it being apartheid versus, because some people are still like, don't use that incendiary language. But what is the case for it actually being apartheid in Israel?
Oh, there's every bit of a case. It's clearly evident. The Palestinians are treated as, I wouldn't say as fifth class citizens. They're the indigenous people of that land, and there's clear-cut Israeli divisions. And so, first of all, the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they don't have voting rights. So they don't have...
But do Palestinians in other areas of Israel have voting rights?
Yeah, they do, but they're heavily discriminated against from within Israel. So we're talking about the Palestinian citizens of Israel who are basically remnants of the 1948 Nakba, or the Palestinian catastrophe, of the Palestinian families that managed to stay there. And they were, there were not many then, but now with time, they're about 20 to 21% of the population of the state of Israel. So they're considered Palestinian citizens of Israel. They have citizenship. They do have voting rights, and they do participate in the Israeli Knesset, but they're an extremely ostracized, discriminated against minority group from within Israeli society. I mean, the most recent clashes between Israeli police officers and members of that community last month goes to prove my point. So so they're. And, there's, I think it was recently that Arabic in the state of Israel was demoted as a de facto language of the state. So there's more and more policies that put in place to discriminate against those people, to alienate the Palestinian presence. And by the way, they're not referred to as Palestinian citizens of Israel or Palestinian Israeli, which is the accurate definition. They're referred to as Arab Israelis, as though, this mere definition or label troubles me so much because it's very inaccurate. People keep saying this. You hear it all the time, different media outlets and channels, not all, by the way, but Arabs versus the Jews, and that's like one misconception, as though the two terms are mutually exclusive, as though a Yemeni who was residing in Yemen and then migrated to Palestine, became an Israeli, is not an Arab Israeli just because they're Jewish. So there are so many Jews living in different parts of the Arab world who migrated to the state of Israel. They're Arab Jews, right? So it's only normal to refer to them as Arab Jews because, before they were Arab and now they're Israeli. But no, they're not. They're Jewish, so they're Israeli. But Arab Israelis are basically, when they communicate that in the media, they're referring to Palestinians, but they just don't want to mention the word Palestinian, because Israeli policies have historically been aimed at alienating the Palestinian presence, fighting culture, fighting the people, their aspirations, their hope, their accomplishments, and it's just part of a bigger plan. We need to make it clear for our audience groups that, this Arab versus Jews is not an accurate comparison. It is not a conflict between Arabs and Jews. Arabs and Jews can be one. A Moroccan Jew, an Algerian Jew, a Tunisian Jew, an Iraqi Jew, an Egyptian Jew. There are Palestinian Jews too. I mean, Jewish people were all over the entire Middle Eastern region and in North Africa, and they were well received when compared to their history of misery, alienation, and murder in Europe. The Jewish communities in the Arab world were historically much better received, and they were living alongside Christians and Muslims and other groups. So, and then, many of them moved to Israel because of international Zionist propaganda. So
that makes me remember this Debra Messing Instagram post that we wanted to sort of like debunk or look at. But before we do that, let me just clarify what you're saying. Like, so is Palestinian, is it an ethnicity?
Palestinian is a national identity.
So it's like a multi-ethnic place, would you say?
Multi-religious. It's a Palestinian is a pure national identity. For me, it's even a cultural symbol representing years of civilization and natural evolvement of humans in that
from
land.
That region. So
yeah, exactly. So, but it's not by any way, shape, or form affiliated with any religion. There is a sizable Christian Palestinian community. It's the most ancient Christian group in the world. Are they less Christian than the Christians in America or the Christians in Europe? They also want their rights. They also want justice, right? They're the most ancient because Jesus Christ was from that land. He was. So, and there are Palestinian Jews too. There are Palestinian Jews too.
So those Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Christians that live in Israel, they're still under this apartheid system. No, Israeli citizens, not the ones who have citizenship. The ones who have citizenship in Israel are Israeli citizens. So they're
no longer considered Palestinian.
They identify as Palestinian. If you talk to them, you meet with them. They're Palestinian citizens of Israel, but the apartheid state here is in reference to the West Bank and the Gaza.
So that's what I was curious too.
You have close to 4 million people in the West Bank and 2 million. So those are significant concentrations of people living there for years. Yeah. But no, we're not talking about apartheid here. Does not refer to the citizens of Israel.
Okay, so that So that's probably why some people might, claim that it's not apartheid, because they're only looking at the citizens of Israel. They're just completely ignoring all the Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza, which actually makes no sense.
Yeah. But even when we talk about this minority group of Palestinian citizens of Israel, they're still
ostracized.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. And do you have any sort of follow-up questions on that?
Is it clarifying things? Let's go to the Debra Messing.
Okay, yeah. So this kind of interested me on several levels because it's infuriating, one. The other thing too is that, I was talking to actually Yasmin, your sister. The cat's out of the bag now. And she was saying that she was trying to post some Palestinian things on Instagram and it kept being taken down because she was accused of misinformation posts, right? And yet this post that I'm going to share my screen when I figured this out. It is so clearly, in my eyes, misinformation, but it's got so many likes and they've never taken this down. So
it's helping in controlling the narrative.
Yes, I think it's really interesting actually because it seems so false. So let's see if you can see this.
Oh yeah, no,
this. So yeah, so it's like 10 pages. Debra Messing puts it up. It has 21,000 likes. She has a lot of followers. She has 1.4 million followers. So that's just to get an indication of the people that are listening to her. And it just says, like, at the top here, I read online that Israelis are ethnically cleansing Palestinians. And the response being, stop taking everything you read online for face value. Palestinians face many challenges and inequalities, but are not being ethnically cleansed. However, Jews have been ethnically cleansed from the rest of the Middle East. So that's something.
I really don't know what this person is talking about. Go on.
And also, this is something that you already. This is something that you already sort of covered. Is that historically the Arab Empire? Actually, she talks about this here too. She actually talks about this in the second page. Isn't the Israeli-Palestinian conflict just a Middle Eastern argument over land between Muslims and Jews? Yes, but not the first. Jewish people, I don't know what that means actually, but not the first conflict or argument, I think. Jewish people have lived in Jerusalem for thousands of years, and they've lived in the Middle East for ages, being oppressed, raped, and murdered by the Arab Empire, like Palestinian Christians. So, but you actually talked about how prior to Israel being formed, that they actually had pretty good relations in the Middle East.
Absolutely. Jews were a minority religious group, much is the case with the Jews in Europe. The Jews have always been a minority numbers wise, okay, everywhere they were. I mean, they're the most ancient monotheistic religious group. That is an undeniably true fact, So they were in numbers, in big numbers in Morocco, they were in Tunisia, they were all over in Egypt, they were in Damascus, they were in Iraq, even in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen. The real clashes between Jewish Arabs and the hosting Arab authorities started in 1948 as a result of the atrocities that were committed in Palestine and, against the Palestinian people. So international Zionism, with its very strongly backed propaganda, actually targeted those groups and scared them up. And told them stories like, oh, the Arab authorities are going after you. Why don't you escape? Come on, there is a newly formed state for you. You will get citizenship. You will get, your rights. You will get, financial benefits and so on and so forth. So, obviously most of them went. Because there's this newly created state with so much money, so much Western backing, promising everybody a better life. And people are average humans, they want people are going to go for better opportunities, regardless of what ethnicity, religion you're from. You know what I mean? And so that's what happened. But no, it just started in 1948. So for her to claim that this, I don't know who wrote this. Anyway, it's stupid. I don't like that. It's like pollution. You know what I mean? It's like brain pollution. You know.
It is.
Yeah. So for her to claim that the Jews were ethnically cleansed, I mean, there are still Jewish families in Morocco still residing there, living. There are still Jews in Bahrain. You know, most Jewish left to Israel simply, there's better opportunity. And there's propaganda, people are going to go after you. And maybe they felt unsafe because, and rightly so, maybe some just felt unsafe because of, the conflict and, the mess that, occurred in Palestine. But they went to a rich state that promised them opportunity, finances, medical care, and all those perks. And so I don't think that's ethnic cleansing. And I was speaking to a Syrian friend the other day, and he said that the houses of the Jewish families are still there. No one can. They're in Syria. Basically the Jewish families that fled and moved to Israel after 1948. Their houses are still, apparently, according to what he said. I'm not sure if that's true, but their houses are still there. And but that's the thing. They like to deviate our attention. It's like, how is that even relevant? How is that even relevant to the conflict on the ground today? There is a state of Israel. There is a state for the Jewish people, regardless of where they are. Is there a state for the Palestinian people?
Yeah, so that brings me to that concept of the two-state solution. That's something that's brought up again and again. I mean, the idea of, is that even a possible solution right now? And also what is it? Define it for us.
Well, basically, the two-state solution, aims to create an independent Palestinian state on the remaining 22% of the land that was considered historical Palestine. So when we're discussing the two-state solution, it's very important to note that the Palestinians have made quite a painful compromise in the early 90s, in the sense that, they recognized the right of the state of Israel to exist on 78% of the land that was theirs before. So, and that was a huge compromise, simply because they wanted to advance peace talks and, negotiate with the Israelis. Unfortunately, I don't think Israel was ever serious about it. As I said, Israel is the only government there, is the only internationally recognized, powerful government there. So if it really cared about a two-state solution, why didn't it push it forward? Why did it not push it forward?
I guess their claim is that Yasser Arafat, am I saying his name right? He was the one who didn't want it. But I also read that it didn't include water rights. So there's that's just one detail, to that situation. So it might, I guess the idea being that like you're saying, it wasn't a good faith negotiation or a good faith offer to do a real two-state solution.
And I think it wasn't born in Gaza, where they listed all of the rules and all of the laws, basically, for the rights of Palestinians, and they continually disregard them, but nobody's holding them accountable.
I think that was in...
Or was it another one?
Freedom. Yeah.
I don't know. It could have been another. I told you, it's merged.
It's merged.
Sorry.
Yeah. It's all the Geneva Convention rules, the
national law,
all international law. It's just completely being ignored over and over.
Yes.
So exactly. Why, if there's even footage in these documentaries, which I don't think there's any question about it being altered footage.
No, there's too much footage, I think. There's just too much footage.
There's all this evidence. Why is nobody holding them accountable?
Well, the answer is that Israel knows that it can continue its brutal military occupation, and it can continue the process of oppressing Palestinians with more impunity. It acts with impunity. It's never really held accountable. So from their perspective, from the Israeli perspective, it's stalling, it's buying time so that there's more settlement activities in different parts of the occupied West Bank, just to basically make life miserable for Palestinians so that they somehow could, voluntarily leave because of misery. I mean,
but they can't leave. Like in Gaza, they can't leave. They're literally just killing them.
Yeah, so that's actually brings, I guess, us to the idea of the ethnic cleansing, because that is something, I think apartheid now, I think that's accepted. That's kind of accepted that that's the case, apartheid. But genocide and ethnic cleansing, those are still in contention. Like, I mean, just last month, I think it was last month, Mark Ruffalo had come out with a statement calling the situation genocide. And then Bernie Sanders actually came out and said, do not use this sort of incendiary language, even though he is more for the rights of Palestinians than most other politicians. But he came out and said, it's not helpful to use this sort of incendiary language, genocide. And then Mark Ruffalo came out and retracted his statement, apologizing for using the word genocide. And so it just kind of made me wonder about genocide, the definition of it, really. Like, it's just ethnic cleansing, targeting of a specific ethnic group, right? And how watching this Gaza Fights for Freedom, where they control everything, the borders, the water, like she's saying, they were saying that by 2020, the lack of clean water is going to make that area inhabitable, and yet they cannot leave. And then also the other thing being, they cannot rebuild the rubble. Like, every time Israeli bombs their buildings, they bomb the water desalination plant that cleans the water, and they cannot rebuild it because of the sanctions. So none of the materials that they need to rebuild these really important buildings, they can't have any access to it. So how, I guess, like, the thing that's so sad and fucked up about the situation, I was thinking of another word apart from fucked up and I couldn't think of anything, but like, what's so fucked up about this situation is that, are you actually going to say it's not genocide because it's just so slow? That's what it feels like. You take away, you control the calorie thing so that it's like per person. Like, you bombing farms, you're bombing these like important buildings that are there to make the country or the area sustain itself. And then how are they supposed to survive, long term with those conditions? It's just, so to me, it actually does seem like genocide but it's just a very slow one, okay.
But it's also divisive tactics, because you never know what's going to happen in the future. I mean, no power knows, right? I mean, sometimes you plan with all the tools that you have, the political tools, the wealth, the power that you have as a government. You plan things accurately. You think you're calculating things very conveniently, but then you end up being surprised because the reaction might not be, or the outcome might not be the way you plan things to turn out into. So genocide is, genocide, ethnic cleansing. I don't think the Israelis are going to be happy if the Palestinians just left in groves and occupied different, places in the Western world and whatnot. I don't think the Israelis are going to be happy to have the Palestinian refugee crisis, which, by the way, has been ongoing since 1948, to be fully endorsed and internationally acknowledged. Because once you acknowledge a group of people as refugees, you're immediately going to question their story, right? And the Israelis don't want to have the name of their state associated with the misery and the destruction of these people, their culture, their lives, and their livelihoods. And and there's been, and that brings us to the question: have y'all heard of a single attempt, a single genuine initiative, attempt on the part of any big Western government to sort of acknowledge and absorb Palestinian refugees as a political campaign plan? Have you? No. But you've heard of the Syrian initiative, like.
I mean, I would say that's even iffy. Like in terms of the U.S., they allow.
We don't want any refugees.
Yeah, so few.
Well, yeah.
And then,
which is ridiculous.
In terms of the UK as well, we cut it down to such a small number. I would say the only country in Europe that has allowed refugees in bigger numbers would have been Germany and Turkey, which is like only 3% in Europe. So maybe doesn't really count. But yeah, Turkey's taken in.
You're never going to see Palestinian refugee as a part of any of those bigger, political campaigns. It's never been. The Palestinians who ended up residing in different parts of the Western world, who excelled in their fields, and then you saw them as, Congress people. I mean, you have Rashida Tlaib is a good example, yes. Right? In the U.S., those are all exceptions. Those are people who, managed to go with their own skills and, their means. They helped themselves. No government helped them migrate.
Right.
They were never.
I mean, I guess this brings me to your personal lived story or your parents' personal story. Changing track a little here. So how, because you do still identify as Palestinian, but you've never been there, I'm assuming.
Yeah, well, for me, it's as I said, it's a cultural identity. It's a cultural identity that could explain the perseverance and the resilience of the people. It's a statement, you know what I mean? So I think, obviously, if you have historical ties and roots to the land, then more so than some other random person, but a Palestinian can be everyone. You too can be Palestinian.
I feel that would be cultural appropriation. If I said I was Palestinian, that would not be correct.
There are so many non-Palestinians who fully endorse the cause as a human cause.
I definitely do. As an ethical human, I think, cause. Yes, as an ethical conundrum, as just a logical thing, I would say, of course, it just does not make sense to allow, without remark, without exploration, the occupation of a state in this particular way, like in this horrific way, which I'm saying is like ethnic cleansing in slow motion, I think. But I know that it's not as slow. It's not as slow, but in terms of, I guess, the resistance, and I think we've been watching some. By the way, I'm not letting you get off the hook. I do want to get into your family history a little bit later, but we've been watching these interviews with different Palestinian refugees. I think just recently some in Syria, and one of them, it was an Aaron Mate interview, and she talked about the armed resistance. She was saying like the only way forward is the armed resistance of Palestinians. That's the only way. And I think the thing is, like, whether or not, I am anti-war, I am. However, I kind of look at the options in this particular scenario. And what are the options? We have the armed resistance, which I think this past month, a lot of reporting that I've heard and listened to is that they're pretty amazing for how little resources that they have, what they've managed to accomplish. Just like the guerrilla warfare or whatever tactics that they've used with their limited amount of resources.
You're talking about the militants in Gaza?
Yeah, the militants in Gaza, the militant resistance. So that's one area where you can actually kind of see that they're maybe growing in number because of their cause. Of course, that's like everyone's like understanding that's not the best case scenario, but there is that faction. And then there's another one, which BDS, which I would say is more of an international movement idea. Boycott, divest, and sanction. And that would be the one that I would be like, well, isn't that the no-brainer one? Because it's not pro-violence. It's using peaceful means. And the sanctions towards Israel, it's sort of specifically targeting weapons. Like, so I find it really hard to I don't understand why people are against BDS. Like, to the people against BDS to the point that in America, there's been several attempts to, and the last one, even Bernie Sanders, I think, signed off on it, which was to make it illegal, to make it that you're not allowed to stand for BDS. And Abby Martin, the filmmaker for this documentary, she actually sued the state of Georgia because they made her, she was going to go there as a guest speaker, and as a guest speaker get paid, right? In one of the universities, I think. And they made her sign a document that said that she would basically pledge allegiance to Israel and not be part of like BDS or anything like that. And so she sued the state of Georgia and she won, which was a good victory. But the fact that that even exists, that to work in Georgia, you need to sign something like that, just shows you where the US is.
I mean, Israel is, as a state, is considered a very strategic state for the United States, and that's, you know, complicated politics. But I think where most, I would say, ignorant people, you know, fall victims is that, you know, they think that, you know, being anti-Israeli or anti the state of Israel does not make you anti-Semitic. That's, you know what I mean? Like, Arab people are Semites. Arab people are Semites. The Lebanese, the Palestinians are Semites too. So, and by the way, anti-Semitism stemmed from, again, historical racist Christian Europe. That's where anti-Semitism, that was the birthplace of anti-Semitism. And then it became a worldwide phenomenon in the United States. And that's, but you're against the government. I mean, a government cannot continue to act with full impunity and, you know, commit crimes against humanity and, you know, continue to confiscate land, demolish houses, and, you know, make people refugees and uproot families from their ancestral homelands, you know, and shell entire neighborhoods and entire buildings and create so much destruction and kill innocent children and, you know, peaceful protesters in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere without accountability. That's just crazy. That's just insane, you know. And we can't continue to, you know what troubles me more now, it's like, oh, I would hope that for the both parties to find peace and a resolution that would benefit the two parties. And what is that? We've said this all along, and how is that rhetoric going to solve a problem? You know, there's clearly an occupier, a powerful military occupier, and an occupied. There's clearly an oppressor and an oppressed. Those are not equal. Sorry. So those are not equal. So,
yeah. So which brings me to the idea of Hamas being a terrorist organization. What do you think of that? That's what it's being accused of.
Well, you know, countries are free to label resistant forces, you know, in whatever form they find convenient. However, you know, I like to think of things more on a practical note, on a practical level. You have a resistance force in the Gaza Strip, okay? And if you're bothered, if you're, you know, one of the most, you know, advanced armies in the world, and you're bothered by a bunch of, you know, resistance people in Gaza because, you know, they happen to be the only ones defending families and children, you're bothered by them. Why don't you engage them in the discourse? Forget about what they say. Forget about their charter. Forget about, you know, I mean, that's irrelevant. I feel all these different groups should be included in the discourse, in the political discourse. And Israel has power dynamics playing in its favor. So Israel, I mean, I tend to hold more powerful parties more responsible than the vulnerable ones, especially when the vulnerable ones are a bunch of people without a recognized government. Then what do you expect from them? No, I think it's definitely Israel's responsibility to acknowledge that, Hamas is a resistance political organization in the Gaza Strip. It is religious, yes, and we could disagree in principle with any form of religious organizations. I guess you two share my mindset. I mean, I'm very much anti politicized religions, But when you think of it this way, when people have been extremely vulnerable for more than 50 years and, they don't even have basic human rights, they're powerless, they're oppressed on a daily basis. Our nature as humans, we're vulnerable beings, but the more that we're reminded of vulnerability, that's when people seek a divine connection, a spiritual, a religious connection. It brings them the sense of unity, it brings them meaning to life. So you can't just alienate and blame when for so long these guys hadn't even managed to gain their basic human rights. I mean, who knows? Had the three of us been brought up in Gaza and had we, lived the horrible living conditions, who knows what we would have been like? Who knows what our belief systems would have been like? Because, and Gaza, by the way, was never like that in historical Palestine. Gaza was an extremely prosperous, city full of cultural commerce and, plays, music, you name it. Gaza was an important Palestinian port, was an important, significant historical Palestinian city. So, you're looking at Gaza now and you say, oh, look, there are a bunch of radicalized people who want the destruction of the state of Israel. Well, I mean, you have been occupying them for so long and they're deprived of their basic human rights. What do you expect them to do? Just to say, okay, fine, come on in, kill us, and we're just going to shut up? I mean, that's why, I don't think look, the United States even has an example with regarding foreign groups. The Vietnamese were once called the terrorists but then with time, the United States negotiated with them. All these groups, you have a confrontation with a group, you claim that you claim you have a confrontation with group, State of Israel versus Hamas. Well, engage in political discourse, end the occupation, lift the Gaza siege, okay? Let people live, let them control their lives. And then if they still continue, once they have their full rights, whether it be a two-state solution or full equal rights as one state, whatever it is, and if they still continue to fire rockets, then hold them accountable, but not now.
So just to back up again.
You're giving them every bit of a reason. As an occupier, oppressive, stronger, brutal military force, you're giving them every bit of a reason to retaliate with firing rockets. What else are they going to do?
Yeah.
And because now you associate it, but they're smart. They work on the marketing of the whole, the entire conflict. But they're associated with Islamic Jihad. And everybody hates Islamic Jihad. Well, let's not forget, Islamic Jihad was supported by the United States when the Islamists were meant to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. Who do you think gave them all the weaponry, the training, all the radicalization? I mean, Hillary Clinton once confessed in one of her videos, and then when things don't go the way you plan it, and then that's exactly the point. Hamas was only created 39 years after the creation of Israel. Hamas is a relatively new religious political organization. The thing is, Israel was very much concerned about the escalating political events of the first Intifada of 1987. And the Palestinians were then governed by the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was completely secular, by the way. And the very first founders were very intellectually motivated and smart young individuals who were very left-wing and wanted to, fight for their homeland and for their people and fight for justice. And it was a completely, marketed as a human left-wing secular cause. Obviously, Israel did not like that momentum, did not like that rhetoric. And so the very founding of Hamas as a strict religious political organization, in those early years, that was in favor of Israeli Zionist political agendas, because they wanted a force that would counter the influence of the flourishing PLO. And, that did create clashes between the Palestinians. Let's not forget that. The PLO and Hamas fought for some years, but then things don't go as you plan. And now Hamas is, a political organization of so many fighters. They're developing their own weapons, their own rockets, and they need to be part of the discourse. You can't alienate them as terrorists. I mean, fine, call them terrorists, call them whatever, include them in the discourse. They're a political resistance force. There is no state of Palestine. I don't care if they, happen to be Muslim, Christian, Jewish, whatever. They don't represent all Palestinians. Not all Palestinians share their ideology.
But they were democratically elected, right?
They were.
But that was a long time ago. When was that?
2007.
Okay. So you were saying there's...
But then again, I mean...
Yes, yeah.
We're not Gazans. Like, I'm not... you know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like, they were. But they're still a political, religious organization. It needs to be part of the discourse. There are still religious organizations in the United States and many parts of this world. You have different parties and different political parties, and some political parties are more strongly religious than others, and so this happens to be an Islamic political organization. Now, in principle, I don't believe religion and government should be mixed. I personally don't believe that, but I mean, I can't just, as an outsider, I can't.
Yeah, I mean, as an atheist, I also don't agree with that. But your point being, like, I mean, so Israel, like the PLO, right? And also historically, America has sort of dismantled a lot of democratically elected governments that were more left-leaning, that were more socialist, that were secular, etc. So this is a continuation of that. It's very much in that playbook, So in terms of that, but I think my point being with Hamas being democratically elected, though, is therefore this idea of it just being like a ragtag terrorist group, it's kind of like what we're sort of sold in the West. Like, it's just this crazy terrorist group using all Palestinians and children as human shields, That's kind of the messaging, even in the last what would you call it, the last bombings by the Israelis in the US and the UK. It was like, well, why did Hamas throw some rockets over? Like, if Hamas didn't want people to die, they wouldn't have done that. That's kind of the idea behind the messaging that we're getting.
All this political rhetoric that gives Israel the green light to act with impunity under the pretext of self-defense. They have the right to defend themselves. Well, why can't the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves too? And by the way, speaking of the terrorist label, the PLO was considered terroristic in the past, and they were not affiliated with Islamic Jihad. The radicalization of Muslims really started in the 80s and 90s. And the US had a major role because they were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. And so it was politically strategic and smart to sort of, support a group that could, work and serve bigger US interests. In the US won that conflict, against the Soviets in Afghanistan. But then you have a group of people that you helped empower, that you supported with weaponry, with training, with radicalization, and those people are going to continue. And so you have other shoots, you have, other like radical shoots. So I still think, like, if justice prevailed and we had less divisions and we had less racism and we gave people their rights as decent human beings, we would see less of all of this mess.
Yeah, I mean,
So I really don't think I don't think Israel is necessarily doing things the smart way, because it doesn't serve the average Israeli citizen's interest to continue to blame the other as terrorists and alienate them and not engage them in political discourse when your mere security as an Israeli citizen is also being jeopardized and threatened. During this last confrontation, Israeli citizens were in shelters. I mean, can you imagine if life here in the Western world was that about shelters and military? And that's not, you know what I mean?
I mean, the ironic thing is that the Gazans had no shelters. Like, so that's even worse. But like, as you know, of course, you know this, but I just think it's funny because even if you look at what the Israelis were going through during that confrontation, let's call it.
Of course, I'm not comparing it. I'm not comparing it. But what I'm saying, because they keep on, playing that rhetoric of, our safety, they want to kill us and we're scared and whatnot. If you're really genuinely scared, you would end the occupation.
Yeah, you wouldn't throw people out of their houses.
That's why I don't think their argument is strong enough. If you're really genuinely concerned about prosperity, peace, and security, you would advance peace talks in a constructive political setting with the Palestinians, because, those are the two parties, the state of Israel and the Palestinians, and you would work out a solution. And there's not going to be a viable solution without justice for the Palestinians. I mean, why would there be?
That's why it looks like an ethnic cleansing, because there is no other solution being presented. And the way that things are going now, the intention seems to be ethnic cleansing, because they're not taking into account the resistance.
Absolutely. And the sad part is that despite all that positive momentum that we've experienced in the Western world that has become more in favor of the Palestinians and greater awareness for, their miseries and the atrocities that have been committed. Now the political rhetoric in the state of Israel is moving more strongly on the right-wing side and becoming more strongly racist and divisive, to where, like, I think a few weeks ago, you had people protesting, right-wing, conservative Zionists protesting and chanting things like "death to Arabs" and "the best Arab is a dead Arab," and things like, I heard one of their guys was saying the second Nakba is on the way, as though they're proud. The second Nakba is on the way. Obviously, I'm not going to hold these people accountable. They're indoctrinated citizens. They're not the government. They don't represent, you know what I mean? But it's the culture. It's that political culture that is more increasingly right-wing in Israel. Yeah.
There's definitely something going on in Israel, like you said, like they are being indoctrinated.
It's unfortunate because, I guess if you were to carry out a survey in much of Europe and even in the United States, most people are not going to be against the ending of the occupation. I mean, that's my feeling.
Well, Anne was telling me last year, I guess now, that she hadn't even heard the term occupation to do with.
Yeah, I didn't.
No, it's fine, and it's fine.
It was, yeah,
and it's fine. But I mean, if you brought it up to and sort of gave a brief introduction to the history, the conflict, whatever, to average Americans, Europeans, or you name it, most people are not going to be against the ending of the occupation.
Well, I mean, if they don't even know about it, like, because this is called the Ignoramus's Guide, and we are claiming ourselves as ignorant, but I would say we're not really like below average, ignorance.
I don't think
so. So the fact that like Anne, you were saying you never heard, what had you heard if you hadn't heard the term occupation?
I really didn't know anything that was going on, and I was researching it because I wanted to learn more about like the Shiites and just different things that I wanted to know on my own. And I started putting on documentaries, and it was like occupation. And I was like, except for something that somebody does for work as an occupation, I didn't know what it was. And so I had to figure that out before I could even go forward with the documentaries, because it was super ignorant. But I feel like that's honestly the norm. I'm not uneducated.
Yeah. You went to college.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can read. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're not like the biggest ignoramus. Like, I wouldn't have met you and thought you were.
I mean, about some things, absolutely, but it's not a common thing. And here it's like, in the United States, we don't always look at world problems, and it's just what's around us. What we see that's it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, the fact that you have like $3.7 billion, right, foreign aid to Israel per year. Is that right? That's about 3.6 or $3.7 billion. So the most foreign aid from the US is going to Israel. That's not well known. That's not well known in the US, and that's your taxpayer dollars.
But it's becoming more well-known now, and especially after the recent events. I mean, social media played a huge role in bringing out the Palestinian voice. We've seen protests all over, the Western world and Europe, and those were very strong protests in the United States, in Michigan, other parts, Chicago, New York. So the Palestinian rhetoric is finally gaining political, it's some political momentum. It's still not ideal yet, but there's change. There's change from within the US too. And I was reading an article the other day about the shift in the views of the evangelical Christian groups who were historically extremely in favor of Israel, again for certain biblical reasons. And now that belief is shifting, and they are no longer adopting or endorsing the Israeli side as before. So things are changing, and we should always continue to be optimistic. I mean, the thing is, if we're not, we're just going to lose hope. So I think there's all kinds of beautiful works that are being done on the part of many interesting Palestinians in America and other parts of the Western world and elsewhere. So it's, I think Palestine now, if you still, like, after the most recent events, if you still are oblivious about, Palestine, then you're probably very ignorant, because, trust me, I've met so many people, traveling the world and living in different places. Many people did not know what Palestine was. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some people wanted to they knew, but they were politically motivated, and they pretended like they didn't know. I remember, like, I had a conversation once with a South Korean who pretended he didn't know what Palestine was. And then he said something about Israel, or he said something. And I was like, well, a minute ago you pretended you didn't know about it. So look, it looks like you do. Oh, I called him out on it. Oh, it pissed me off. I called him out. I was like, but I thought you didn't know about it. It's like, so why are you? It's like, you know what I mean? But now it's going to become. Yeah.
I mean, I think you're right, because, like, okay, so I brought up the Mark Ruffalo thing because to just show that there is still some pressure in the US to sort of like to really posture words with this. And however, I remember telling Anne about this, like when we started this podcast, I was like, well, we should probably cover something like, the ignorance around Palestine. That was like last year. And then I was like, of course we're going to get immediately canceled. Like, just the idea of even mentioning it. I think now we won't. I mean, I feel a difference, and I don't know if it's just because like, having done this podcast, it's just like so interesting to talk to different people that maybe I feel like, I don't know, like maybe more optimistic or something, or more naive. I don't know. But I feel like it's not. Yeah, go ahead.
There's a shift, right? If we're able to finally see things on social media, and that's not all being censored, that's the only way to, in this day and age, I feel like now where we've all gone to social media, that's the only way to really do awareness in the current state. And so if it's not being censored,
I mean, it is a little bit like we're saying,
well,
Yasmin
yeah,
put some stuff up that would take
it's still
down.
being censored, but not censored,
not
but not
completely.
100%.
Yeah, not completely, but people are still losing their jobs. I mean, Cornel West, you know, just very famous Black intellectual in the US. He wasn't given tenure in Harvard, and he thinks it's because he supports Israel, Palestine, not Israel, because he supports Palestine, and he wasn't given tenure, so he was effectively fired. So it's still in the establishment, but I think it's slowly changing in terms of, like you're saying, the social media. People are a little bit more aware now. And if we feel less scared, or if I feel less scared talking about it, then I can't be the only one. I mean, it's not like we have a massive audience.
The sad part is that the sad part of the story is that why should people even be concerned about speaking in favor of justice and equality?
Well, you know because they can get fired. I mean, that is the point. Is like you can.
Of course, no, I'm aware of that. I'm aware of that.
So it's
that is sad. But that is
so sad. And actually, I mean, I'm not really personally that scared, but I was just, you know, looking at, for example, Jeremy Corbyn here in the UK. He was smeared as an anti-Semite. And really so it was politically motivated, those smears. But if you look at what they were saying, it was all about Palestinian rights. Like it had nothing to do with anti-Semitism in terms of for him. Like maybe one or two people in the Labour Party were actually anti-Semitic, but he was tarred with the brush of anti-Semitism based on, I think, Palestinian rights. And his career is pretty much destroyed, completely destroyed. So it's a very effective weapon, definitely.
Absolutely. And that's why I think, it's obvious that it's also like a part of this ethnic cleansing process when you continue to fight the mere presence, the culture, the history, the people, you know, their identities, their accomplishments, when you are against acknowledging them as Palestinian, it is just one small part of a bigger package.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And
you're erasing them. Like you're saying, you're erasing the Palestinians in Israel through.
Oh, absolutely. But also like diminishing and continue to belittle the significance of, you know, this people who existed historically in this land and who had a very thriving culture and who have, by the way, have produced some of the most notable intellectuals and, you know, scientists and whatnot. And they excelled everywhere they went. In the Arab world, they were, you know, a very unique community in different places. And in the U.S. too. I mean, you know, sometimes like you get all kinds of racist comments saying like, why should the Palestinians deserve a state? What have they produced? I said, oh no, they have produced so much with very minimal means, despite all the hardship that they have to endure on a daily basis. There's still been examples of Palestinians manufacturing all kinds of smart products and, you know, promoting businesses and entrepreneurship in the occupied territories. That's not to mention Palestinian contributions in the diaspora. I mean, look, if Edward Said, I'm not sure if you've heard of him, if Edward Said was living under the occupation in Gaza, who, by the way, was a Palestinian intellectual born in Jerusalem, Palestine, 1935, and moved to the United States as a high school student, and then got a PhD in English literature from Harvard, and, you know, obviously became a very important American intellectual. His books are still being taught at, you know, all across the country. If this guy was living under the occupation in the Gaza Strip, you think he would have managed to leave behind an academic legacy that is still influencing many generations of intellectually inclined individuals and you know, progressives around the world? Hell no. The thing is, but he's still Palestinian, right? 13 years of his life, he grew up in a Christian Palestinian family in Jerusalem. He was uprooted from his homeland, then he went to Egypt, and then to the United States. So he's not entirely American either. I mean, obviously, America was a big part of his identity, his place of residence, his, where he got his education. I'm not saying he's not American, but he's also a Palestinian American who was born in Palestine.
But I am just going to push back on this idea that you have to be a contributing member of, the world to have the right to live. I mean, to have the right to have a place.
No, but of course you don't. Of course you don't. Of course you don't. But what I'm trying to say is that despite all those contributions that are very clearly evident, are you still in a position to completely eradicate and erase and belittle those people and say they don't exist?
That is, I think that's like one of the I mean, I wouldn't say the first, but it's just one of the very clear, obvious steps towards dehumanization, sort of claiming that an ethnic group is useless. It's like, it doesn't contribute or something. And so you erase all contributions, all historical facts, really. I mean, that's just one of the many, many weapons of racism that happens. So that makes sense. Yeah. So, okay. So going back to sort of like, we were talking about your family history. You weren't born in Palestine.
Don't forget that part.
You're like, but like,
But go ahead. No.
Because your parents, were they born in Palestine, or was it?
They both were.
Okay. And so when what was it like for them to leave? Like, how did they leave?
Well, they left, I mean, what was the number? Around in 1948, 800,000 Palestinians were uprooted and, were forced to leave their houses, their cities, villages, places where they had been residing forever, and they became refugees in a matter of a day or so. So my family, my father's side of the family was from the city of Haifa. My mom's side of the family was from the city of Java, so they're on the coast. And my maternal grandfather had just bought a house where my mom was born, and then he basically lost it. They basically lost everything behind. The bank accounts were confiscated. Palestinian money was worthless, and the homes were taken. European Jewish settlers at the time, migration focused more heavily on European Jewish migrants. So Jewish settlers were put in those Palestinian homes. And so those Palestinians left Palestine, most of whom went to neighboring countries, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, other countries in the region. And then later, many went, I guess that even at the time too, many went to, I'm not sure if many, I don't know the statistics or the numbers, but, they went everywhere in the world, including the Western world, the US, different parts.
So, yeah, and I think this is what Anne was referring to, was like your parents or your dad went to Kuwait? Both your parents?
Both my parents were born in Palestine.
And then they moved to Kuwait? Was that?
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, my grandparents moved to Kuwait in the early 50s.
Oh yeah, because of course your parents were children. Yeah, they're not that old. And so sorry. And I think that was what Anne was referring to when they weren't given citizenship. So they went to Kuwait and they weren't given.
Well, okay. So if we're now we're talking about a completely different topic. So the Arab countries and how the Arab countries received the Palestinian presence. Now, there's something that's called the Arab League, which is, a political, I call it a dysfunctional political organization of all these Arab states. And the idea at the time was to discourage the naturalization of Palestinians in the Arabic majority countries, and which is something that I'm, as a political economist, what I'm very strongly against. So the idea was to discourage the naturalization of Palestinians under the pretext of preserving the Palestinian identity, and so that they can, return back to Palestine. It was marketed under such reasons. And so most Palestinians, the ones who fled to Jordan in 1948, for the most part, received Jordanian citizenship. Jordan was a very new country that didn't have that many inhabitants, and wanted to develop into a Hashemite kingdom. So Jordan did naturalize the Palestinians that came as a result of the 1948 conflict. But the other Arab countries did not. But there were some Palestinians managed to get citizenship in different Arab countries, but it was not because they were Palestinian. It was, on an exception basis. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's definitely, it could be a discussion for another topic, because that's like Arab politics. But yeah, that's a very good question. There was a very strong Palestinian presence in the Arab countries, which, if you were to take me back in time, I would have preferred that they'd gone elsewhere, basically, and not because, you're talking about a group of countries that are still, undergoing political and economic turmoil. They're not, they're not necessarily strongly autonomous and, establishing that, independent, from an independent policy perspective. So for a vulnerable group like the Palestinians, I would have preferred that they, went somewhere with more, where they could have been more empowered, as opposed to, where they were in different parts of the Arab world.
Yeah. So much misinformation. And people who I do think people are paid to put that misinformation out there and to do what that guy did, continually engage with people until
like Debra Messing, it's like, I'm sure she wasn't paid for that, but like, how is she so ignorant? I'm so shocked, actually, by her, because it's been up there for like, I think, months. So, like a normal person would have figured out that's super embarrassing and taken it down. Like if you posted it by mistake, because she was given it by someone else, So it's
if that's what you were raised believing, and you don't know any better.
Yeah, I guess, like, but that's the part that's, she's an adult. It's not like she's 12 years old. She's an adult who has access to reading material.
Oh, but also, like, don't forget that they're desperate because they know they're losing the media war, right? They know that, and so they're desperate to sort of. Sorry,
I'm not sure, because amongst all my circles, it's obvious, right? Like I'm struggling to even understand the other side, to be honest, right? Like I can't even really find any legitimate pushback.
Just all about power.
Yeah, it's just about power. It's like we were saying, it's an occupation. It's like very, very clear cut. Like it's not that complicated in terms of what's going on. It's just very, very clear morally and with principle. If you just look at the situation, so obvious, right? Yep. So it's hard to even understand the other side. Like, to be honest, I think the only thing that I'm hearing is that, but are you saying that Israel doesn't have a right to exist? Are you saying that Jews don't have the right to have a country, And we
never said that in our, we've been talking for more than an hour.
Yeah, we've never even said that.
We were just
I
didn't even think about that.
The closest thing that I may have said was just that there were people there before you came, like that. But that doesn't mean that I think you don't have a right to have a home. Like that's not what we're saying. And yet
exactly. And you know what? Because they claim, which, it's a religious claim. They claim, we have a very strong 2,000 to 3,000 year connection to that land, and so we want to come back. Okay, fine. 2,000 to 3,000 years. Oh God.
You're very old.
Anyway, I'm not going to discredit that claim. I just want to take their perspective for temporarily, right? So if you're claiming, which is, by the way, based on your religious interpretation, this is your promised land, and the Jews had a very strong connection to it. By the way, the Jews have every bit of a strong connection to Egypt, if not even stronger. Does that make it right for them to take over Egypt? Probably not. Definitely not. Sorry, what do you mean probably? But if that's so if that's your claim, and you came back 2,000 to 3,000 years after, then why can't a Palestinian go back 73 years after? The real people who have the title deeds, the house keys, and the documents are the Palestinians. Their presence, their historical ties to the land are more easily and conveniently traceable. You can't, 2,000 to 3,000 years.
Yeah, how do you trace that? But even that idea is that it's so ridiculous. Is that because people have been there after you, so you're just like,
and it's fine, and they came, and it's fine. We can't just go back to 1948 and sort of undo all the political. We're not in 1948, right? Yeah. They're there, and
now they've been there for generations too.
Exactly.
So it's not
there's so many Israeli generations that been born and raised there, and no one is asking them to leave, but they don't have the right to kick somebody else out just because they happen to be of a different religion. That's it. Simple. Fine. You came, you were living there. You don't get to kick somebody else out. You don't get to oppress them. You don't get to ethnically cleanse them. You don't get to occupy them. Did I say occupy twice?
No, I think.
It's like occupy.
So let's say they claim it Israel as a Jewish state, right? So then if there's an atheist Jew, or if somebody is like, oh, well, I like this other religion better, and converts, what would happen?
Look, if you can prove Jewish ancestry, you could all you have to do is like book a plane ticket, land in Tel Aviv, and you're gonna get citizenship there. If you can prove, that you're Jewish. I think it's, if you're born to a Jewish mother, if you can prove Jewish ancestry, they don't really care whether you're practicing or observing the religion. As long as you can, prove Jewish ancestry, you are automatically guaranteed your right of citizenship. Whereas someone who was born in Palestine, okay, and uprooted, ethnically cleansed, had their, parents, grandparents, great-great-grandparents, born and raised there, doesn't even have the right to visit, let alone gain citizenship.
And it kind of seems fucked up from, you have the Holocaust, and it was hard for people to even have that recognized for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like the kid who gets bullied on the playground, but to an extreme amount, who then finally gets a little bit of power, and then is
bully
like,
another kid.
Bully another. Yeah. And it's like, where is the empathy? Where is...
I don't know. I trust me, that thought, like the more I think about it, the more I get personally depressed. It's like, where is that human empathy? It's like, how could you even represent, or, if your ancestors, were bullied, ostracized, murdered. Bullied and ostracized at the very best, but at the very worst, even murdered in one of the most heinous crimes. So how could you even have the capacity to commit similar crimes against another people?
And then even use it as an excuse. That's the thing that is so
really
shocking.
Troubling. It's really troubling. It's extremely troubling.
And it's why actually when I went to the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, some of Otto Frank's writing was just so beautiful, because he really did talk about humanity, like that people can do this to people. You know what I mean? Like he didn't make it about just being Jewish. He really understood this idea of human cost to humanity, to the evils of humanity. And that's how it should be. Like if we look at it that way, then this wouldn't be happening, you know, in Palestine. If we looked at it that way, that we're all part of this human race. Oh my God.
There has to be a clear, genuine effort on the part of well-established Western governments to sort of end this decades-long brutal occupation, because, you know, people have been suffering for decades now. And, you know, the atrocities, as I mentioned, don't belong anywhere in this 21st century mindset. We should condemn the occupation and work and, you know, and strenuously to end all, you know, the horrific violations of human rights that are occurring in Palestine. You know, again, the solution is up to the two parties. They can agree on a solution, but, you know, I don't see a solution being possible if justice is not guaranteed for everyone, regardless of ethnicity, religious background, or whatnot. There has to be justice in order for us to really enjoy peace and security.
Well, thank you so much. And I think we covered a lot. I really do think we did. I don't know if we made things simpler or more complicated, because I came into this being like, it's actually very simple, but it's a lot of details.
Complex, and to go from 0 to like 75, it's hard because you're like, what, who, where, when you're that ignorant, which a lot of people are.
I mean, I think the main thing about the ignorance is like, just like we're saying, the fear of even speaking about it, because you're scared that if you do talk about it, you'll be accused of being anti-Semitic, you know? So if you remove that fear, then, or being accused of being...
Well, but it's also exposure.
Okay.
Because you have to be exposed to it to then even have that fear, and you have to be at a specific level to have that awareness.
So you're saying that a lot of people are even behind what I'm even saying.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, I thought that was rock bottom, level. But you're saying that there's a much lower.
Yes.
Oh, are you kidding me? Of course. I mean, I don't, of course. Yeah, most definitely.
Ahmed looks so disgusted with me right now.
You guys are very but like, you guys are very aware of many, like, I wouldn't even consider you remotely ignorant about.
Oh no, I am. I totally am.
I disagree. I mean, I've had.
We agree about a lot of other things, so this is fine. You can disagree on this one. The Ignoramus' Guide to Surviving Humanity is available as a podcast on Spotify and Amazon Music.
You can also like and subscribe to our videos on YouTube. And if you want to help us grow, then you can become a patron on Patreon. And that's it, right? I think that's it.
Yeah.